All set? All right, ladies and gentlemen, at about 10 minutes past 1, we are reconvening the 167th meeting of the Mass Gaming Commission at the Heinz. We have one item left on our agenda again, which is a discussion about fantasy sports. Before we start this, I want to put a little context in this. Among other things, what we are and what we aren't doing, and what our role is and what our role is not. We are not the decision makers on any of the policy questions that might have to be resolved by policy makers. That will be, to some extent, the Attorney General, but fundamentally the legislature and the governor. We do, however, have an interest in the gaming world, and we do have a lot of experience in introducing a new gaming industry, and we have a lot of experience in the issues of whether and how to regulate, whether and how to license, and so forth. There's been some expressions of interest on the part of the governor and the legislature, the legislative leadership, the speaker and the president, in having us weigh in with whatever thoughts we might have, recommendations, suggestions, and we are more than happy to do that. We have a modest legislative mandate to kind of keep an eye, particularly on the electronic world, in part to make sure that we continue to keep an eye out for the health of the lottery. So we do have a mandate to kind of watch what's happening out there. And we also have some concern that our licensees, our casino licensees, don't have the playing field radically changed on them while they are in the midst of investing lots of money in a bricks and mortar casino. So we have a number of interests here. But the key point is to make sure that it's clear that we are not a decision maker, nor are we a regulator of fantasy sports. At this point, there isn't one, and if there were to be one, whether and who would do it would be up to the legislature and the governor. Commissioner McHugh, within the last year, or maybe even going further back, has taken a particular interest in the evolving electronic internet-based sports. At various times over the last year and a half, different ones of them have been principally in the news. There was a big hoo-ha about online poker. There's been lots of discussion about online games in general. There's been some discussion about online lottery games. At various times, different ones of them are the main topic of media discussion. It happens that at the moment, fantasy sports is the main one. And we will end up focusing on fantasy sports. But as far back as a year or so ago, Commissioner McHugh and I discussed his interest in sort of tracking all of these new electronic internet-based gaming possibilities in order that we could be kept abreast. And he was working on a memorandum which would kind of give an overall status report of all of these new industries before he left. One of them is fantasy sports, but only one. So I thought it was a good place to start to have Commissioner McHugh kind of give an overview of the status of the internet gaming world, maybe give us a heads up about other things we're going to need to keep an eye on in the near future, and then we will pivot into a more detailed focus on the fantasy sports issues. The memorandum that he will now talk about is in our folder posted on the web in its entirety.
All right, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I'll be brief about this because the memorandum is in the packet and is available online, and there are hyperlinks in it to the various sources, many of the sources on which I relied. But I have been following this for several years, and it is a rapidly evolving area, and that's why this memorandum that I wrote probably will be out of date in 3 or 4 days. But in any event, it's what things look like, at least to me today. And the basic background is that internet gambling is illegal in the United States with a number of exceptions. The default is that it's illegal, except for games of skill and horse racing. Throughout Europe, it is a very different picture. Internet gambling is heavily regulated, widely available in Europe. Illegal internet gambling is widely available here, and so far as anyone can tell, it is here a big business. In fact, the fact that it is such a big business is one of the drivers toward a regulated market here in the United States. Internet gambling is allowed in 3 states, Nevada, Delaware, and New Jersey, with respect to casino-type games. Initially, before the games were rolled out there was concern about making sure that the players of these Internet games were.
Excuse me, Jim. Rather than have the memo on the web feed, which nobody's going to be able to read, why don't we have the commissioners on the web feed? Sorry.
Some of the two of the big initial concerns as this was being rolled out was whether or not you could make sure and ensure that the people playing the games were within the state boundaries where the games were being offered, and whether you could assure that no underage players were playing. That has been largely solved. The industry's largely solved that. Internet gambling is up and running in Nevada and Delaware and New Jersey, and a geolocation mechanism has been created that assures that the players are within the state borders. The identity protocols are significant and rigorous. Nobody can prevent somebody who is overage from giving a credit card or an account number to an underage person. That's just impossible to prevent, but by and large, people are satisfied with that piece of it as well. One of the problems to its implementation has been the reluctance of credit card companies, for a variety of reasons spelled out in the memorandum, to pay and process gambling charges, even at legal sites. But recently PayPal, which is a very big payer in Europe and a big payer in other spheres here in the United States, has begun testing payment protocols in New Jersey, and that may well resolve the problem that the credit card concerns have created. There basically are 5 different kinds of internet gambling now: casino-style gambling, social gambling, skill-based betting, which really isn't gambling, sports betting, and fantasy. And I'll just touch briefly on each of those. The casino-style gambling is prevalent in New Jersey. Basically, in New Jersey, you can go to a website hosted by a casino, and in New Jersey, all the licensees are casino operators. And you can find slot machines, you can find blackjack games, you can find poker games, you can find everything electronically that you could find in a casino. In Delaware, the same is true. New Jersey accounts for about 90% of the internet gambling revenue in the United States for the moment. Delaware accounts for a very small amount of it. And in Nevada, there is only poker. Only poker is allowed. And because there are so few players in Nevada and so few players in Delaware, Delaware and Nevada have entered into a compact that allows Delaware players to play poker in Nevada over the internet and Nevada players to play poker in Delaware over the internet. In Massachusetts, there is no internet gambling. There are 3 bills in the legislature. One would allow, if enacted, an online lottery games. A second would allow online, what the bill says are online games of skill, including fantasy sports and poker. And the third would allow casinos to operate online gambling under regulations the commission promulgates. None of those bills has gotten out of committee at this point. 2 of them, similar bills to 2 of them, were in the legislature last year and did not get enacted. So that's casino-style money gambling, and you go to the sites, you put down money, you play the games, you get money or you lose money, and it's just like being in a casino itself. A second type is social gaming, and social gaming takes the name from the fact that initially, at least, the entry and the pathway to the social game was through Facebook, and much of the gaming play is an invitation to get your friends to play with you. You give information to the operator of the game, But now there are social games that you can access from places other than Facebook. And what differentiates the social game from the casino games I just described is that you play for play money, and you can't take the money out of the game. In other words, you can't win money in the game and then use the money for goods or services or other tangibles outside the game itself.
You said you cannot.
You cannot. And typically, a gambling is defined as a price for a chance for a prize. And if you get all three of those together, you've got gambling. If you take the prize away from it, which the social games do, you don't have gambling. You've got a price for a chance, but no tangible prize. All of these games operate, and they're still, notwithstanding the fact that you can go to them alone as standalones, not through Facebook, there still are an enormous number of available games on Facebook. All you have to do is go to your home page and click on the column on the left-hand side that says Games, and there's an almost infinite number of offerings that will appear. They operate, the vast majority of them do, on a so-called freemium model, which is that you go to the game and you get a certain number, a certain amount of play money to start for free. You start off with some play money, and if you use up all that play money, you can buy more for real money. And as a consequence, across the globe, there are estimates that the social gaming of that type is a $30 billion business today, which is astonishing. But there it is. Those are the estimates. A third category are games of skill, and those aren't gambling because you are actually playing a game that requires skill to play, although there are elements of chance in the game, inevitably, but skill predominates. I listed in that memorandum a website called Skills, not because I'm advocating or touting Skills, S-K-I-L-L-Z, but because if you go there, you can see a true skill game. There's a bowling game there that depends on how you actually throw the pin down, the ball down the lanes, and is, for all intents and purposes, a game of skill. And you can bet in that game. You can find another player to play against, and you can bet in that game against the other player. You both put in the same amount of money, and the winner gets the pot. And there are other like games around, and you play that one on a tablet. Others you can play on a desktop, but that one is a tablet-based game. Then there's betting on horses, and there's regular horse race betting. There are a number of apps where you can sign up. They all operate on in a model called advanced deposit wager. You go to the website, you put some money in a pot, and then you bet out of that pot, and if you win, the winnings are put into the pot. If you lose, the money's taken out of the pot, but the pot is there, so you're not paying on each race as it occurs. This is allowed under the same set of federal laws that allow off-track betting in other contexts and forums, and it is a vibrant, live industry in which you can bet on horse races taking place anywhere in the world. You're not limited to a particular track. Many of these sites allow you to bet on races in England or in the Middle East and other places where South America, where horse races are going. All in real time, all with track odds, and all for all intents and purposes as if you were there at the track, except you're not. Professional and college sports betting on professional and college sports events is, we know, a large enterprise in the United States. There are estimates of the amount wagered, but on the internet, it's illegal. There's a federal statute that bans it. It is legal in Nevada at Nevada bookmakers who are authorized. It's also legal in Delaware because there was an exemption from the banning statute that carved out Delaware and Nevada because they allowed sports gambling at the time the statute was passed. In Nevada, it works through bookmakers. You can go bet on the fortunes of the Red Sox, for example, if you want, at the bookmakers there. In Delaware, it operates on a so-called parlay system. You have to bet on a number of contests, and you have to win all of those. You bet on all of those contests in order to win the wager at all. So it's not the same kind of individualized betting that occurs in Nevada. And New Jersey currently has a lawsuit pending in an effort to have sports betting allowed in New Jersey and have the courts declare the federal statute that prohibits it unconstitutional. They've lost at the federal district court level. They lost at the panel level in the Court of Appeals, which is the next step up. But the Third Circuit, which is the appellate court that governs that area, has recently allowed a motion to have the case reheard by the entire court, and it is going to be very interesting to see what that court does when it does get to the rehearing. As I said in the memorandum, lurking in the shadows, sort of, thus far, but soon to emerge, is something called esports, and that is a form of sports betting and sports play that has gained a huge audience, but it's not a mainstream audience yet. That'll change next year. The largest internet purveyor of this kind of betting is this kind of sports activity is something called Twitch TV, which is owned by Amazon. And they estimate and say that they are now broadcasting over the internet 1.5 million internet games each month to 100 million monthly viewers. Basically, the way this works is you have two professional athletes, and there is a professional group of athletes who play these games. In fact, the State Department has authorized a professional sports visa for the players of these games. They play these games with illusory or imaginary. They're typically battle games or contest games, either people shooting guns at each other or armies of bizarre-looking creatures attacking each other. And two players each has either a bunch of gunmen or has a bunch of these armies, and they attack each other, and somebody ultimately is standing at the end when all the shooting is done, and that person wins. They distribute the games over the internet. You can tune in on any of these sites where these games are played, and you will hear play-by-play as the live play-by-play by a broadcaster and then a color person. I mean, it's a replica of professional sports. And there are also, in countries and jurisdictions where it's legal, betting opportunities, and the odds keep changing as the betting keeps changing as the game progresses. So you have not only a chance to bet, but to improve your bet as things go forward. That's where this is now. It's well known to a demographic, I think, but not to mainstream yet. But that's going to change next year because Turner Broadcasting is going to have two 10-week tournaments in which a number of these professional athletes get together and do these battles, and it will be like a pyramid, like a playoff, and then the last two will be standing on Fridays, and their battles will be broadcast on Turner TV live on Friday nights. So you can tune in to the Friday night battles on Turner Broadcasting next week. And finally, we have fantasy sports betting, which is the topic that we want to spend some time on today. Initially, fantasy sports started with Rotisserie Leagues, so-called rotisserie because it started in a restaurant called the Rotisserie, was season-long activity in which you began at the beginning of a Major League Baseball or Major League Professional Football season, assembling a team of real players, and you played with that team throughout the season. You paid an entry fee to a league. You could trade players as you went along. You could change the team, and at the end of the season, whoever had the best record with the fantasy team, and the best record was dependent on the actual performance of the various players on your team. That person got all the entry fees as a prize, or at least a large percentage of them. That's morphed now into the thing that we're most familiar with, and it's attracted the attention of all of us, into daily fantasy sports, in which you assemble. The process is essentially the same. You assemble a team, but the outcome of the game is based on how the team does in 1 or 2 days rather than over the course of a season. And there are other approaches. Indeed, if you go to the Red Sox website, you can go to the Major League Baseball site, where there is a game called Beat the Streak, in which you pick a player, and if that player beats Joe DiMaggio's 56-game hitting streak, which I think was 1941, if that player beats that streak, then you win the prize, but you stay with that player all the time. There are other variants not offered by Major League Baseball, in which you can go and pick, for example, 57 players, and if they all get a hit on the same night, you win, you beat the streak, and you get whatever pot is there. So there's a lot of variety to the fantasy, the short-term fantasy, in the short-term fantasy world. The prizes, the weekly prizes, the daily prizes are in the millions of dollars. It's big business. It's gotten a lot of publicity, and that's what we're here to talk about today. But that's the context in which this occurs.
That's great. And I feel like having crammed for a test to kind of hold all this in my head and remember it. But it's really helpful, and I think as we go through this process, we want to be mindful of the fact maybe there will be other things. It sounds like this esports thing will take off. That maybe we ought to be thinking about a template sort of for how we might suggest the legislature consider all of these things as they start to come along. All right, so let's turn our attention to the last thing on Commissioner McHugh's list, which is fantasy sports. Again, I just want to set a little bit of a quick context. I think that the decision makers, policy makers about fantasy sports are basically going to have to decide 4 things. One, is fantasy sports legal? The Attorney General is the Chief Law Enforcement Officer of the Commonwealth. She has already weighed in on this issue. She picked her words quite carefully, I think. She said it's something to the effect of, at least on first impression, that she did not believe that the fantasy sports was in violation of any state or federal law. That's not precisely the same as saying it's legal. But she is the person who will make this decision at the outset. But she's gone on to say, I've noticed in the last day or two, that really the question for the legislature, and I think we agree with this, is whatever the technicalities of the law are at the moment, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, whatever they are, whether it is technically legal or technically violates a law or not, the question really is, should it be legal? Do we want fantasy sports to be legal? The Attorney General, I think, has pretty much laid that out there. So that's the threshold question. Should it be legal? I think she would probably agree that whatever the legislature decides, pro or con, that we would be well served by some legislative attention to a statute which directed it, that spoke to it directly, so we could understand clearly what is legal and what isn't legal. But in any case, we won't be talking, other than for background information, we won't be weighing in on whether or not it's legal. But if it is legal, if the Commonwealth decides that it's legal, wants to go forward, then it has to decide, should it be regulated? There are all different kinds of regulation. You can have a regulator, you can have a regulation which is regulated by an entity, such as a gaming commission, or you can just have consumer protection laws like we have for lots of other consumer activities. Should it be regulated? That's a question I think we can offer some advice on. Next question would be, if it is regulated, who should do the regulating? That's not for us to decide, that's for the legislature to decide, and we won't be weighing in on that question. But the last question is, if it should be regulated, what needs to be regulated? What needs to be attended to? Do we look at this through the same prism as we look through casinos in terms of that kind of regulation, or is it a different kind of regulation? And again, I think our experience can be beneficial in that thought process. So those that we'll primarily be focusing on the issue of should it be regulated, and if so, what needs to be regulated, what issues, what critical variables need to be attended to by the legislature in a regulatory environment. So for starters, we ask a member of our legal staff to, Catherine, do you want to introduce Justin and his task?
Yes, for the commissioners and for our people watching us online, Justin Stempek is an attorney in our legal department. I asked Justin to take a look at the concept of fantasy sports, and he has done an overview of both the law in Massachusetts and then what's going on in other jurisdictions. So he's happy to answer any questions or present on anything you would like him to discuss. His memo is in the packet as well.
Thanks. Justin?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. As Catherine explained, the memo I put together is essentially it's a survey of looking at the history in Massachusetts of gaming law, both statutory and in case law, to see how the framework evolved, what it applies to, what it doesn't apply to, and then also looking at some federal statutory frameworks that are at issue and you've probably seen reference in the news, as well as some you may not have seen, and then also looking at a sampling of how some other states are addressing the situation, be it through regulation, like Nevada, or through legislation, like some other states, or through some other mechanisms. So, I mean, probably the best place to start is in the Commonwealth itself, and looking in the Commonwealth, really what I examined was the divide between what's called an illegal lottery, which is it's the hazard of a wager based on chance to win a prize, as Commissioner McHugh mentioned, and that is, I think it's important to note, is not just a lottery as a normal person may think of it, where you buy a lottery ticket, you have a chance to win something. Lottery has been broadly applied in a whole range of games that I go through in the case law that I cite there, but where the court analyzes whether there's a predominance of skill versus chance in a particular situation, and that's always been a question of fact. Courts look at a variety of different factors to render their conclusions. So those factors have ranged in the various cases they've looked at. The other sort of half of the analysis is looking at, there's some statutory framework in Massachusetts that addresses what are betting pools and registration of bets. And those statutes are interesting in that they criminalize a lot of the behavior associated with running these bet registration services or these betting pools, but there's sort of a gap in an explanation of exactly what the statutory definition of, say, a bet. Case law defines a bet, and there's case law that is good in Massachusetts that fairly old, but is repeated as recently as 1992, which talks about a bet as risking money upon an incident where one or both parties could lose by chance, and there's an uncertain outcome. So that says that's a bet, and there's cases that say that. So you have to look in those two lenses, the lenses of legal lottery, the lenses of whether there's sports pools or there's some sort of registration of bets in a given contest, and look at those. And that's sort of a question I would say that, perhaps falls outside of the Gaming Commission, simply as that's for the decision makers, as you mentioned, Mr. Crosby. That's a statutory interpretation question, and maybe an analysis of the case law type question. So there's not a lot of law in Massachusetts that goes through that betting definition framework, but there's some, and it's important to look at that, and that has some definitions therein. Beyond the sort of divide between the betting pools and the illegal lotteries in Massachusetts, we have to be aware of the federal framework here. Probably the most commonly cited statute as it applies to daily fantasy is UGIA, which is the Unlawful Internet Gambling and Enforcement Act, which was a federal statute passed in 2006, which really was a statute that addressed financial transactions. And it was it was prohibiting the financial transactions between gambling institutions and banks and credit card companies. And that statute has been referenced thousands of times in recent articles, but the statute itself, at the very beginning, it says there's a rule of construction, and the rule of construction explains that this particular statute is not meant to abrogate or interfere with any state law that addresses the same topic or any federal law that addresses the same topic. So it's a very narrow scope when you look at UGIA. And UGIA has what has been cited many times as carve-out for fantasy sports, and the carve-out exists in the definition of a bet or wager under UGIA, and I cite it in my memorandum, but you'll see it has certain criteria you have to meet in order to qualify as a fantasy sport under UGIA, in which case UGIA does not apply to you. So it's a narrow statute that I think some sources may have misinterpreted and broadly used and perhaps unintentionally as being the sort of rubber stamp of approval, but it not necessarily. There's other statutes that are federal that are worth looking at as well. There's the Illegal Gambling Enforcement Act, which is often called IGBA, which talks about federal enforcement of illegal gaming. It's predicated upon a violation under state law of a gambling statute. So there's a lot of things that happen if a state law on gambling is found to be triggered, then that could in turn trigger a variety of different federal statutes, which I discuss in the memorandum. So there's a lot of concerns here to think about when you're looking at the various cases, the various statutory frameworks as to if it's determined under one rubric to qualify as a particular outcome, does that trigger further repercussions in other statutory frameworks or in some other context. So it's not just an easy decision, you say yes or no. There's a lot of nuance to this that will trickle down upon a rendering of a decision one way or the other by the powers that be. So I'm happy to go into detail on anything else you may have questions about, but the memorandum is in the commission packet.
So the two points that I drew from your very thoughtful and thorough memorandum were, one, that it's really hard to figure out where in the scheme of Massachusetts and federal law this fits. And by this I mean fantasy sports in terms of its permissibility or impermissibility. Am I right in that?
Yeah, that's correct, Commissioner McHugh. It hasn't been addressed. It's a relatively new field. It has not been specifically addressed in Massachusetts. And trying to find a parallel in the history of Massachusetts jurisprudence is not easy to do because nothing really matches this footprint.
Right. So you can make arguments that it does, you can make arguments that it doesn't, and it's.
That's exactly right.
And the second,
which is why my suggestion maybe in the long run is that rather than debate whether it is or isn't, the legislature probably will need to step up and make a statement as to whether it wants it to be or not.
Right. And a second point that I drew from your memorandum is that this UGIA carve-out, as you talked about, this exception to the UGIA law, basically says that certain transactions, monetary transactions, between a bank and another entity, a financial transaction between them, is prohibited under certain circumstances, but those certain circumstances don't exist if we're talking about fantasy sports as that is defined in the statute. It doesn't do anything more than say the fantasy sports are not subject to this federal law dealing with particular kinds of monetary transactions.
That's right. The carve-out, essentially, if the activity were to qualify as daily fantasy sports under the carve-out in UGIA, that particular operation would be exempt from UGIA.
Right.
But it doesn't speak to other state law, other federal law.
Okay.
Okay, so that is two lays of the land. And now I think it's, yeah.
I did have a question
Okay, sorry.
on your memo. There's the statute 271, section 16A, that talks about betting pools. You just mentioned this very briefly, and there's it does prohibit the illegal registration of buying or selling of pools upon the result of a trial or contest of skill. Is this something, maybe this hasn't been tested at the state level, but is this something that could apply here?
I think it has the potential to apply under these circumstances. I mean, there's one case that talks about what a betting pool is, and it discusses it as a combination of stakes out of which the money for the winner is derived, with the operator of that particular pool taking some percentage. And so there's one case that discusses it. It's an older case, but this particular statute, I mean, it has, as you can see, fairly archaic language, and hasn't really been tested in a modern context to see its applicability under something like daily fantasy sports. But I agree that that's some curious language there when it is talking about the wagering or registering of bets on a contest of skill, which is kind of the hot button word now, skill versus chance. So that, I think it bears certainly additional investigation.
Okay.
Okay, so principally on the questions, should this, now is the time, we start thinking about, should this be regulated, and if so, what should be regulated? I hope at the end of the day, we will sort of come up with a plan of attack, how we are going to try to get our arms around all of these issues, and when we might be able to get back to the legislature. So I know Commissioner Cameron has been at an international conference recently, which was explosive with information and discussion about fantasy sports. And I think she's got a lot of stuff to say.
Yeah, that's true, Mr. Chair. First of all, I want to thank Commissioner McHugh. This was very thoughtful. It's really important that we as a commission keep up with all of the latest trends, because we don't know when and what will be available here in the Commonwealth in the future. And for us to have a working knowledge and understanding is really important for us, I think. Timely conference the week before last, International Gaming Regulators Conference, in which fantasy was a prominent topic. Regulators from around the world, a presentation on fantasy from a technical perspective, and lots of legal questions as well. I have to say, the consensus from regulators around the world is it should be regulated. They really, lots of discussion, and one regulator after another saw issues and said, hey, this needs to be regulated. So it was timely for me to be there, and I'd just like to talk about some of the concerns that were brought up at the conference, and then a couple of follow-up conference calls afterwards to flesh out some of the issues. But I think the first issue is the credibility and the integrity of fantasy sports. I mean, I think that was a concern, an overwhelming concern with people, regulators, as well as those who have some technical expertise. And, the player fairness, if you get in early, do you have a better deal than if you bet later? And again, these are just concerns. They haven't been fleshed out. Everybody was asking questions and trying to get a handle on this. Group play, policy questions about that. Computer playing against an individual, commonly referred to as bots. Scripting programs, computer-aided mathematical analysis, like a decision tree to help you decide how your wager is going to go, what team you pick. The game fairness itself. Is everything available to everyone? Group play, 5 people in one location, a collusion issue. Can the system be hacked? Can the account be altered? Can the outcome be altered? Can you change your lineup after you submitted it? These are all questions that were debated, and I think, lend itself to asking these questions. Insider information, that lends itself, we're talking about a lack of transparency of information here. Questions about licensing and background checks, no outside auditors involved. You can't meet the winner, it's a screen name. you know, descriptions of fantasy were internet game with a mix of skill and chance. So when, you know, the talk about all skill there was no consensus on that, that's for sure. You know, where's the money coming from? Where's the money going? Are there separate player accounts from balance sheets? AML and money laundering discussed, huge issue. There are no safeguards for that right now, as there is with other forms of gaming. We know how hard we've worked as a commission to look at that issue and make sure our licensees have the proper policies in place there. Responsible gaming is another huge piece of this. The National Center for Problem Gaming has just issued a position paper here with fantasy sports, and they had a number of concerns. They mentioned that the demographics of fantasy sports participants, predominantly young male enthusiasts, high risk for gambling addiction. In their opinion, they're preoccupied, unable to stick to limits of time and money. You know, they talk about the difference in fantasy sports, how it's evolved. It traditionally, as Commissioner McHugh pointed out, it was long-term kinds of things. You'd play for a whole season, and there was less risk, but now the contests are faster, and they believe that there's more, a higher risk to developing a gambling problem. So certainly they are advocating some kind of regulation with regard to fantasy sports. Some of the legal concerns discussed, you know, again, we get back to consumer protection, but inside the game, what is the winning percentage? Is there a limit on entries? Is there legal recourse for the consumers? Again, the transparency issue. What are the conditions of the contest? There's a lack of disclosure on winnings, unregulated advertising, and you know, this is one of the attorneys said that Massachusetts residents are the greatest participants in fantasy sports. Now, I haven't verified that, but I was provided with that information. So, you know, it's certainly something for that reason we should be looking at. And, you know, I'm speaking for one commissioner, but I certainly was convinced that this is an area in which should be regulated. So, you know, I might have a little bit of a unique perspective. I've always been very interested in sports betting. I spent a good deal of my career in New Jersey dealing with illegal sports betting, and I've seen the harm. I've seen the harm. Now, and I am in no way comparing fantasy to, you know, illegal activities around sports betting in other locations, other than when an industry it goes unchecked. There are real possibilities for things to happen that certainly we would want to protect the consumer. I know there's one league, for example, that doesn't, their players can play. I mean, that's at least an issue.
A professional
Yes.
league where they can play?
One league, and there's a limit on how much, but I just think in the least that is you know, a perception issue. So just a lot of issues to think about, a lot of opportunity for individuals to have a problem with this, and B, not have the right protections in place in this industry. So I certainly came away thinking that there are issues here, and I, as one commissioner, think that there is a need to regulate this industry.
Anybody else?
Well, I do too. I want to draw a parallel or talk about the similarities of daily fantasy with other forms of gambling that are widely recognized as gambling. And I know there's distinctions, but in the case of poker, there are everybody knows that there's skill involved. There's many forms of skill. You can be a good reader of telltales, the signs, or you can be a good bluffer, you could do good odds, counting cards, whatever it may be. There's an element of chance, obviously, because you get your hand dealt and you don't control that. But there is, the skill comes after that element of chance is introduced. And the performance of the cards is fixed. An ace is always going to beat a king, and so on. In the world of fantasy sports, I would argue it's reversed. The skill comes in first, where you pick the players, and the chance comes in later when the players perform well or not so well. And there's an added version of variability here, just in the sheer number of combinations that any one person can choose by having 10 picks from a large number of players. I did a quick calculation, and if you have 10 picks of a large pool of people in fantasy sports, you would have 10 factorial number of probabilities, or combinations, and one of them is likely to be the winner against somebody else. There's also elements of, I don't know the hand of my competitor, I don't even know the hand who that competitor is in the world of fantasy, but you are indeed, competing against that person. And so I think or many others that you may not know. And I think there's also other similarities to other games. There's an element of pari-mutuel at play here, at least in some contests. So that would fall under the race horse arena. There's elements of sports betting, etc. But and I know we're not trying to answer the question of the legality here, but I think there's enough similarities to other forms of gambling that have been widely accepted as gambling that it merits the regulation that that Commissioner Cameron and everybody seems to be coalescing around. I don't know why, with those similarities, we would treat an 18-year-old and a 21-year-old differently. The fantasy sports, for example, currently allowed 18-year-olds to play in their sites. They also are allowed to do transactions with credit cards, which we thoughtfully and went through a very long process of understanding and regulating, and there is no credit card at the casino or the lottery here in Massachusetts. Why would it be different? And I'm just asking a rhetorical question. Why is it now accepted simply because there's some carve-out or some lack of definition if the activity can be replicated just as much? I mean, if you play fantasy for a whole season, that may be a different story. But if you can play every day, that may change the equation. So the responsible gaming issues, the credit is another area that I think ought to be looked at. I also know, happen to be thinking about, there's somebody drawing a line, just like in the sports book. Somebody saying and making a judgment call that Tom Brady is going to be worth more than Tony Romo, or whatever the case may be.
That's clear.
That is clear.
Or Peyton Manning, or
And
Drew
that's
Brees.
yes, that Tom Brady is going to be at the top. But even Tom Brady has a bad day every once in a while, by the way. And there is that element of chance that I was talking about earlier. And you just mentioned this very quickly, Commissioner, but if that line progresses over time, you're either coalescing around a sports book or coalescing around pari-mutuel betting, in my opinion. And if that line is not visible to the participants, there may be a real question of consumer protection there, in my opinion. I don't know if it is or it isn't, but that was allegedly what gave trigger to this investigation by the FBI relative to the allegation of insider trading. If the people making the lines are also able to gamble elsewhere, then maybe the game is not really as fair as one might seem. And I think it all goes back to the question of fairness, which was the first point you made. For the participants to continue to engage, which I think is something that the industry would be very interested in, they have to be perceived as being fair, and I think there would be a case for disclosure regulations, for example, just like there is in the world of finance, to ensure the public confidence in the process that at a minimum would be a starter for all participants. So I for one think that there's there's a big business case, if you will, for regulation. I know that there's other questions to answer, but that's a big issue in my opinion.
I would just like to jump in on the fairness piece here. If you think about it, as we all have, all of our gambling regulations, and they're now hundreds of pages long, are designed to protect basically two interests, maybe three. The integrity and fairness of the play that's offered to the bettor, the consumer, to ensure that the game, the dice game, the card game, is what it purports to be. And a second major interest is to protect the revenue stream and the taxes and the investments that the Commonwealth is getting. And together they promote consumer confidence, which is a third interest, and the consumer confidence in turn will get people to continue to play the game. And so far the tax piece is not present in the fantasy world, but the consumer protection interests that underlie most of the gaming regulation are. And it extends well beyond the credit, the collection practices and the like. It's everything that is built into the regulation as to how the game is run. The fact that you can't change the dice, the fact that only one person can touch the dice, the fact that you have to call out when the bets are over, and this high descriptive atmosphere and regime that we've created is designed to ensure that the thing is what it purports to be, and that people can have confidence that somebody's watching to ensure that the thing is what it purports to be. And it seems to me that any transaction, any form or any vehicle by which lots of money can be transferred from one person to another needs that kind of oversight from an exterior source to ensure that the conditions under which that money is being transferred from one to another are conditions, A, that everybody knows about, and B, that are in fact observed. So it seems to me that this is, when you get to that level, no different from the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, the New York Stock Exchange rules, the SEC rules. All of this is designed to do the same thing at bottom, and you just need to have somebody watching carefully when big sums of money are being transferred from one person to another, in other than a purely private transaction.
Mr. Stebbins, do you want to weigh in?
Sure. I don't want to go through and echo everything that my colleagues have said, and for the most part, and in general, I agree with the comments that have been touched upon. I think for me, there are three areas of concern interest that I have. Much of those have been touched upon already. I'm a former rotisserie guy, and show you how long ago I played. They would mail us the results every week, so it certainly wasn't anything as tech savvy as it is today. And I usually drafted guys who were already on the DL. Just to tell you how good I was. I think what's been interesting is a lot of the developments have taken place in the last few weeks, is that there have been statements from within the industry talking about protecting the integrity of the game, the integrity of the devices. And that is obviously a similar comment we hear as we approached introducing expanded gaming into the Commonwealth. I've followed the developments of the industry saying, you know, there is certainly room for us to self-monitor our. You know, I worked for a manufacturing association. I think there would have been a lot of people concerned if we all decided to, you know, monitor ourselves on behalf of all manufacturers. Some of the other areas that interest me, Commissioner Cameron laid a lot of them out, but some of the basic, just going through one of the websites that's been discussed was my concern in not really identifying or finding a complaint process. If you go down to Plain Ridge right now and start to play one of our machines, there's somebody you can call to contest the results of the machine. We can pull the device out of the machine. You can call a gaming agent to come over and talk to them. They can go back and reveal surveillance footage. And one of these sites even said that, you know, one of the principles for agreeing to play is that you will not be allowed to participate in a class action lawsuit. So there's some pieces of it there that are being taken away that I didn't see protected an individual from at least being able to raise a complaint with one of the sites they're playing on. I guess the third thing I want to touch on is as we go through this thoughtful conversation about regulation, and Commissioner McHugh's memo laid it out pretty specifically. The interesting elements as we move into a new age with an internet piece of gaming on the horizon, that we're thoughtful and consider things that we talk about. I think we also need to consider in the broader picture of the future trends of internet gaming, how our bricks and mortar facilities may use pieces of internet-based gaming to advance their business interests as well. But that being said, you know, I certainly think we need to move the conversation ahead, move the discussion ahead, perhaps bring in some subject matter experts on the technology side of this who can help us give additional guidance and further our conversation around potential regulations.
You know, I think that something that, you know, through the process I was thinking about as Commissioner McHugh was going through his overview of the internet gaming developments that could very well be stale very soon. What of each of these states is to their view of, and we're thinking about our own state, of course. Our view of this particular case may open the door to a number of games that we don't know of. Your notion about what's in the future, what's the next version. If the platform is, you know, the internet and technology and the speed at which things get developed, and we simply see this as, well, we're calling it skill, so we're okay. That may mean a number of things in the very near future that we just, you know, may not be prepared to deal with, just because of the way that technology and all these games evolve. So having a thoughtful process, I think, maybe engaging other parties, and maybe I was thinking we would probably put some talking points, a memo, maybe like what we did with our prior white paper relative to the tax law as it applied to the Gaming Act, and for the purposes of these ensuring some robustness to the gaming industry. Maybe there is, you know, something that we could put together to advance that conversation and inform policymakers as to what the decision points may be. One of which is there's a big unknown here, depending on how even something as simple as the definition of bet is looked at, whether by a court or by by others.
I think it's clear that certainly the consensus here, and it's commonsensical, I think, that there needs to be some degree of regulation of this phenomenon. But there already is. We have consumer protection laws on the books which would relate to this of some sorts. And there are lots of transactions. I think of used car salesmen. You know, we regulate used cars. The Lemon Law, then the Attorney General has a whole range of laws that she can use to oversee a number of transactions. We don't necessarily set up a regulatory body for every industry that needs to be regulated. We come at this from the standpoint of the casino industry, which is the most heavily regulated industry on earth, in a way that I think all of us think maybe is a little much. And I think we need, and I don't have an answer to this, but I think we need to think about this industry and try to get some kind of a philosophic frame on it. Why does it require what level of regulation? Does it require an agency, or does it just require some new consumer protection laws? The casino industry is a cash business, which is an extraordinary phenomenon, as we now are beginning to see ourselves, and it's an industry with roots in, as we know, organized crime and a terrible history. This is neither one of those. So I just think we need to think carefully about what is the appropriate level and structure. There's got to be something, like the kinds of things we've already talked about. I wonder whether Justin, Catherine, Paul Connolly, who's going to help us on sort of the broad policy side of this, might think a little bit about whether there is a way, is there a mechanism for saying, this is why this particular industry deserves this level of regulation. Why is this different from the casinos, or is it? Why is this different from car sales, or is it? What are the variables that make this subject to whatever level of regulation? So that's one thing. I think we need to try to be really thoughtful and intentional about that. Operators be licensed. You know, that's a really interesting one. It's at the heart of where we are in our industry, again, for understandable reasons in the past. But I think, again, we need to kind of think about, why do we license? We don't license everybody who does business. We do make them certain things, but if you want to come in and open a grocery store, you know, it's, again, why do we require some people to be licensed? Why do we require casino operators to go through the kind of incredible suitability checks that we put them through? And do those same criteria apply here? I don't know whether they do or don't, but there needs to be some contextual framework that gives reason to where we propose coming down on this. The idea of outside experts, now beginning to think about how we go forward here, I want to be very careful that we don't cut the grass of the legislature. They will be having hearings. They will be having people come in and talk about stuff. But I think if we were to use some outside help in helping us frame these questions, what issues might the legislature want to look into? What might be a philosophic structure of regulation? You know, why might we recommend that this be heavily regulated or less heavily regulated? If we're having outside people, and maybe the industry too. I mean, they have a right, I think, to weigh in on these kinds of questions. And I know there are people from the industry here. I would welcome their contribution to helping us figure out what are the questions that we might want to give the legislature to ask. We're not going to give them the answers. We do, I think, have to keep in the backs of our minds. We do have one fiduciary obligation to the casino industry, and we have been very firm that we believe that it would not be fair to change the rules of the road, to change the competitive environment radically without the bricks and mortar folks at least being at the table. I think we do have an obligation to think about that, and that should be in the backs of our minds. The issue of taxes, as Governor Baker said, there are already taxes applied here on profits if and when there ever are profits in this industry. There are taxes applied to winnings, very familiar. Should there be more? You know, I don't know. I do think we want to be mindful of the fact that this is, I mean, if we came in heavy on this, you can crush an industry like this overnight. This is not, there's some misimpression that people are making money hand over fist. As I understand it, nobody's making money in this business yet. They're operating at a huge burn rate with borrowed money or with raised money, and we don't want to kibosh that industry unless we decide we want to kibosh that industry. We don't want to do it by accident. So those are some of the things that I think, and I'm hearing the kinds of issues that have been raised at conferences, the kinds of issues you raise are great, and that's where I think we can be really constructive and say to the legislature, if you do look into this, these are the kinds of things we want to consider. But I would like to get that overarching kind of approach as well. Commissioner Cameron, you're interested in following through on this, I think, and Commissioner McHugh is too, but he's not going to be here. So, you know, I think having you kind of be our point person, if that works, but we'll all be involved in this. And I think the idea eventually would be to pull together a white paper, hopefully pretty quickly, because this is moving pretty fast. The industry absolutely has what the rules of the road are, so it can get its act together, that we could address these issues. At least, do we think it should be regulated? If so, why and what? That maybe we can begin to outline something like that over the next relatively very few number of weeks.
And in doing so, there's, you know, we've talked about a lot of those aspects, and they cannot be simply the question of the legal framework, even though that's a key one. But the business model has to be examined.
Right.
What are their operations really? What is that algorithm, at least in general terms, understand how people could, how is that calculation take place, and how are the winnings determined?
This is interesting. I think this might be one where you could sort of take point,
Right.
because this is an area that you understand and are particularly, and I'm just winging it here. Please agree or disagree, but I would think maybe it would be of interest to you if somebody from the industry or more than one were willing to come in and talk about the business model, help us understand.
I think
how
that's
this-
key.
Mr.
Their
Chair.
input is key.
Yeah, we've been on a couple of conference calls. We've tried
You
to
and-
educate ourselves.
You and Enrique?
Yes,
Okay.
and another one with
Okay.
Commissioner Stebbins. So we're in the process of educating ourselves, speaking to experts. We are positioned to take these concerns that we've brought forth verbally today and put them on paper with some meat, with some idea. I think the idea of just laying out the concerns is
first step.
an approach. Sharing it with the Attorney General's office. We've already had conversations with them about this. You know, I know they're looking at a lot of the legal issues. So, you know, sharing this information, bringing these concerns forward, I think is appropriate.
The Attorney General considers this important enough that she has dispatched her, I believe, General Counsel to Richard Johnston to join us all day long. Thank you for coming to join us. Yeah, well, I think that would be a really interesting thing to pursue. Any other thoughts, sort of preliminary, either about things we might want to consider, how to approach it?
Well, I think there will be other things to consider, but
Yeah.
I think we'll have some sessions with experts. We'll bring them in. They've already volunteered to do it, to come in and talk to us about these issues, and we'll just work through it and, you know, figure out what we want to put down and have a draft to present and see what further work is needed. So I think the first step is to bring some folks together and talking about what's important and what the concerns are and laying them out there.
Okay. Great. So I don't think we need any votes or anything. I think we're ready to go on this one. All right. We do have one other issue, I'm sorry to say, and as everybody in the room knows, this is Commissioner McHugh's last day. I'm happy to report that we have had two extraordinary Gaming Commission celebrations of Commissioner McHugh's contributions. We had a party where one of our state troopers has a rock band, and he and his band came and played, and there were a number of testimonies, and then we had a staff meeting at the end of the meeting. There were a number more. Commissioner McHugh has made me promise that we won't go back and do any of that again. I guess I'll keep my promise. But the Attorney General has asked for an opportunity to be heard before Commissioner McHugh leaves, and I think Richard Johnston is here on her behalf.
Yes, Chairman Crosby, I've been dispatched here for two reasons. One was to listen to this excellent presentation on fantasy sports, and one to bring the Attorney General's comments about Commissioner McHugh. She unfortunately couldn't be here because she's traveling on AG business out of state, but she did ask me to read a statement on behalf of Commissioner McHugh, which I'll do. I want to thank Judge McHugh for his years of service on the Gaming Commission and for his commitment to public service. As one of the initial commissioners, Judge McHugh helped shape the policies and procedures by which the commission has functioned. He brought his judicial insight on the many legal issues that have arisen with this new industry. During more than his quarter century serving on the bench, Judge McHugh presided over many significant matters, and his tireless work led to important reforms that ensure more equal access to justice for all Massachusetts residents. Judge McHugh will leave a lasting impact on the legal profession, those of us in public service, and the people of the Commonwealth. We thank Judge McHugh for his significant contributions and wish him all the best in his well-deserved retirement.
You're here.
Well, thank you very much. Please convey my thanks to the General for that very generous message. I want to just say a couple of words here. We did have a overwhelming send-off last week, two indeed. But I want to just say publicly that this has been an incredibly rewarding journey. We came together 3.5 years ago, a little bit more than 3.5 years ago now, 7 people, the 5 of us sitting here, Janice Riley and Jamie Ennis, and we moved into a big empty room on at 84 State Street and couldn't figure out for the first couple of weeks how we were going to fill it up. We didn't know each other. Steve and I had worked, Chairman Crosby and I had worked together before, and so we knew each other professionally, but we didn't really know each other. And one of the many thoughtful things the legislature did when it put this statute together was place requirements on the backgrounds of the commissioners, so that we got an array of backgrounds, an array of outlooks, an array of experience to bring to bear on this new and important industry. Bruce came from the manufacturing world. He'd been a White House fellow, the business world, knew that world, was familiar with it, was comfortable with it. Enrique came from the business MBA, served on 2 important financing boards, had been in government finance. Gail had started out patrolling the New Jersey Turnpike by herself at night and wound up second in command of the state police in New Jersey. Steve, an entrepreneur, government service, educator, and I came from a legal background, and we through a lot of really hard work got to know each other really well and to trust each other really well and to think through the complex problems with which we were faced and to build, because we all had the same ultimate outcome, try to build a first-class public agency. When I was first interviewed and I was asked why I wanted to do this, I said that was the reason. It's a new industry, thought the public should be protected, but above all, I thought it was an enormously challenging opportunity to build a first-class public agency. Very few people are given that opportunity. And that's what the challenge, I thought, this job entailed. And as I look now back across those 3.5 years and think about the team we've assembled, and I want you to understand who they are, and so I'm going to just say one word about each of the leaders of the team. Our HR director is Trupti Banda, more than 13 years of HR leadership in the public and the private sector. Catherine Blue, a general counsel who's here today, more than 30 years experience including general counsel in large public agencies and in the private sector. Paul Connolly, who's also here today, our Director of Licensing, who was active and had an important role in public safety in the Department of Homeland Security, technology in the private sector. Elaine Driscoll, our Public Information Officer, who's been a Public Information Officer in Los Angeles and New York and for the Boston Police Department here, all high visibility, high tension organizations, who's been invaluable to us as we've moved along. John Glennon, our Chief Information Officer, over 30 years of information technology leadership in the public and private sectors. Joe Griffin, our Workforce Supplier and Diversity Development Director, 15 years experience and served as a Senior Director of Programs at the Boston Foundation. Derek Lennon, our CFAO, who's done financial work on legislative committees up on the Hill and was the CFO for the Department of Conservation and Recreation. Alex Lightbound, our Director of Racing, who's here today, 26 years of experience in the racing area, a veterinarian, well-respected in that industry. Janice Riley, who's been with Steve forever, and who's held many important positions, who's our Chief of Staff. Mark Vanderlinden, who's the head of our responsible gaming effort, the Executive Officer, who had been the Executive Officer in the Office of Problem Gambling Treatment and Prevention at the Iowa Department of Public Health. Karen Wells, who's here today, our Director of the Investigation and Enforcement Bureau, who most recently served as Undersecretary for Law Enforcement at the Massachusetts Executive Office of Public Safety, assisted by Bruce Band, who had an enormously important role in New Jersey gaming regulation, and by Leos, who'd served with distinction in the Middlesex County DA's office, in the AG's office. John Ziemba, our Ombudsman, who is present at every meeting, and who was co-chair of the government practice section at one of the area's major law firm, and served as acting Secretary of Transportation at the State Police Unit, headed by Detective Lieutenant Brian Connors, who's at the rear of the room. That is, I submit to you, unmatched by any state police unit in the Commonwealth, and is filled with people who not only are outstanding law enforcement officers, but outstanding people as well. That is an A-team. And it is, at this point, a great source of pride to me that we were able to put together a group of that caliber, of that quality, to carry forward the work of this commission in protecting the interests of the citizens of the Commonwealth. We're at an important point now in the evolution of the commission. We're about to get a new executive director. We're about to get a new commissioner to replace me, and I have every confidence in the Attorney General's thoughtful selection process that we'll have somebody who will be able to move seamlessly into the position that I've held. But it's been a great journey. There's some issues and things we might have done differently, but you can't sail through uncharted seas without a few bumps along the way. It's a terrific group, and I am really proud to have had the opportunity to work with all of you. Thank you very much.
Me too. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you.
Do I have a motion to adjourn? So moved. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? The ayes have it unanimously. Thank you all.